Hello, my name is Michael Oswald. I'm going to introduce my friend Rafe Sagarin. Rafe is a marine ecologist and an environmental policy analyst at the University of Arizona. He was in my class at Stanford in 1994, and he's a PhD from UC Santa Barbara in marine biology, and he's a Guggenheim Fellow. He was previously at Google in 2008. He gave a talk from his first book, National Security, which he co-edited with Terry Taylor, and they were both here. And that was a very entertaining talk. So feel free to go back and watch that later if you like. Rafe is an avid runner. Yesterday he was in Monterey and ran the Monterey Marathon in 3 hours and 18 minutes. And he lives in Tucson, where he runs a lot in the desert, and he lives with his wife, Rebecca, and their two daughters, Ella and Rosa, and their dog, Raina. And they have a lovely house that's very desert friendly. He'll be speaking at the Commonwealth Club this evening, and we'll find out when the broadcast of that will be as well. And so without further ado, here's Rafe Sagarin.
Cool. All right, great to be back at Google. Yeah, normally I walk around a lot, but I'm kind of stiff today, so I'm just going to hold it on to this pedestal for dear life. My email's up there. Often some of the things I talk about take a little while to kind of percolate through, and I get often emails from people a couple days or a couple weeks later like, oh yeah, wait, I was thinking about this. That applies to things. And between the Natural Security book that I did in 2008, which was sort of an academic volume, and this book, a lot of what's gone into this book are stories from people in all kinds of fields, from business to soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan who have talked to me about this adaptable process and then gotten back to me with their stories. So I really appreciate a lot of feedback, and I really learn a lot in that mode. So the basic idea of what I'm talking about in this book is how can we learn from nature about how to be more adaptable? And the way I see it, adaptation is really about leaving your comfort zone or being forced from your comfort zone. So if you think about these earliest amphibians dealing with a sea full of predators, they were both forced out of that comfort zone that they were originally in, but they were also drawn out by the opportunity that new niches or new ways of living afforded them. As for me, my own adaptation into a marine biologist who talks about national security now and other security issues really started when I left my own comfort zone. My own comfort zone has always been the tide pools of the California coast. This is the Hopkins Marine Station where I've done a lot of my work. It's right next to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. My work has been on learning how natural systems like tide pool organisms are responding to climate change. But on 9/11, I found myself feeling very disconnected because I was down in these tide pools. I had very close family who were in the Capitol building and other government buildings on the morning of 9/11. Less than a year later, I found myself very far outside my comfort zone, working for Congresswoman Hilda Solis as a congressional science advisor. Ms. Solis's issues, you may know she's the labor secretary now, but she was just starting off as a congresswoman back then in 2002. Her main issues are labor and environmental issues, neither of which were going anywhere in that particular Congress, which was fairly much like our current Congress. That gave me a lot of time on my hands to sort of look at the Washington, D.C. ecosystem as if I were a naturalist, because that's sort of what I do in my day job, is I look at these tide pools and I try to figure out patterns in them and really understand them from an observational sense. And that's really all I could do in D.C. So I spent a lot of time looking at this ecosystem. And what I discovered in this year wasn't hard to see was what I call an ecology of fear. So everywhere in DC at the time, you're seeing New Jersey barriers popping up around monuments like fungus in a ring, and you're seeing new metal detectors everywhere. and new guards everywhere. But what disturbed me about it, which was so unlike the tide pools that I'm so used to studying, is that these things came up and then they just didn't change. And every time I go to those tide pools in Monterey, where I've spent thousands of hours, they're always different. They're always changing. And that got me into this mode of thinking about biological systems and how they always change in response, say, to the defenses of their prey or to the new armaments of their predators. There's this constant escalation and change. And so I thought, what else can we learn from nature about how to deal with security threats? And right away, I came up against an impasse, which is actually one of the things I really like about being a biologist, which is that my biological expertise, such as it is, which may be condensed to the tide pool life of the Central California coast, is such a tiny sliver of the massive biological world that I knew I needed a lot of help to really understand biological adaptation. And if I understood very little of biological adaptation, I obviously understood even less about security. So what I did is I brought together these sort of massively interdisciplinary working groups at a place called the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara. It's a NSF-funded think tank, which usually focuses on bringing people together to tackle sort of big-scale environmental and ecological issues like, what is the state of the world's fisheries? How sustainable are timber harvests around the world? Things like that. But they took a chance on funding my working group, which simply said, what can we learn from nature about security and society? And I brought together this wide range of life scientists, anthropologists, biologists, evolutionary biologists, psychologists, and as well, I brought together a very wide range of security experts, which were practitioners, which were former spies, which were public health officials, and put them all together in a room, simply seated with this question about what we can learn from nature. And the discussions just took off from there and became these very exciting discussions where we touched on just about everything that there is to look at the interface of security and biological life. And what surprised me after a while of doing this is that I thought we'd be completely overwhelmed with the diversity of life, but in fact, we started to converge on a few fairly simple rules of nature, rules of adaptable systems that I felt we could start to translate into things we could apply in society. So I'll kind of go through those high-level ideas, and then we'll drill down into the specifics of adaptable systems. The basic problem as we see it, the basic opportunity as we see it, is that nature faces the exact same problem that all of us do, which is that risk is completely ubiquitous and it's almost entirely unpredictable. And all natural organisms have to deal with that, just like we have to deal with that. The difference being that nature has dealt with it for 3.5 billion years, and it's been surviving and thriving across that whole range of biological evolution on Earth. I break that down a little more. We say that the world is full of unpredictable risk, but a fish doesn't try to turn a shark into a vegetarian. And by that I mean the fish will do everything in its power to avoid getting eaten by that shark, but it doesn't implicitly understand that it can get rid of the threat of predation. And we spend a lot of time in society trying to assure ourselves and spend a lot of resources assuming that we can eliminate risk in our world. We declare a war on terror. We declare a war on drugs. In my own field, we declare a war on invasive species, as if we could ever sort of fully take care of these problems, which are actually just generalized risks rather than specific things we can do. So the organisms focus on the specifics, not on the generalities, and I'll get into that a little more. Another set of kind of high-level ideas from nature is that nature doesn't plan, it doesn't predict, and it doesn't try to be perfect. What nature does is it adapts to solve problems in its environment, whatever form it takes. And break that down a little bit. my exhibit A on this point is this very strange looking fish called the mola mola, or the ocean sunfish. If you go down to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you can see them. You kind of have to see them to believe that they're real. It's the most bizarre looking fish, but if I asked any of you to plan a fish for me, give me a plan for a fish, you would never come up with a fish that looks like this. And yet this has been one of the most successful fishes on Earth. It's lived for millions of years. It's the largest bony fish because it's exploited a niche that was available to it. It's solved problems in its environment and continues to do so. Likewise, we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources doing predictive modeling and trying to fool ourselves into the sense that we can predict the future and then we'll be better prepared for it. But nature doesn't do that at all. Natural selection has weeded out any waste of resources trying to predict a completely unpredictable future. And as for perfection, we often hear about the perfection of nature. If you watch Discovery Channel during Shark Week, they'll say, here's the great white shark, nature's perfect predator. And I always say, you know what? It'd be a lot more perfect if it had laser beam eyes, but it doesn't. There's no way to actually measure perfection in nature. All natural organisms have to be is good enough to survive and reproduce themselves. So it's survival of the good enough, not really survival of the fittest. So here's the thing. Okay, they do all this by being adaptable. And they live without planning, without prediction, without trying to be perfect, just by being adaptable. And everyone's talking about being adaptable now. We always hear it, oh, that company should have been more adaptable to changes. You know, that organization should have been more adaptable. This government agency needs to be more adaptable. But people don't really understand at a fundamental level what it means to be adaptable or how you actually do it. So it just becomes sort of a corporate buzzword. Adaptability, yay. So what I'm trying to do here is break down that natural adaptability into component parts that you can then apply into whatever realm you're in where you have to deal with risk and unpredictability. So the first rule of adaptable systems that comes to us from this remarkable guy, Garry Verma, he was one of my working group members. He's a paleobiologist at UC Davis. And he's one of these amazing naturalists. He can identify any species. And he is even more amazing because he's been blind since he was 3 years old. And so he picks up a fossil and he can tell you everything about what it is, how it lived, how it died. And through this incredible observational sense and a very broad mind as to thinking about how trends in biological history have worked, he has concluded that the most adaptable species are those that are fairly decentralized and they allow a number of independent parts to sense and respond to the environment. And that's one of the reasons the octopus is the central metaphor in this book, because octopuses are a great example of this. Octopuses have a wonderful central brain. They're very intelligent, they're cognitive, they think about things, they can actually think in advance about things. They probably have a sense of self, which is very rare in non-human organisms. Nonetheless, if they're swimming over a coral reef, they don't have that wonderful central brain say, okay, arm 1 turn blue now, and arm 2 turn kind of purple, and arm 3 turn kind of pinkish. What they have is millions of skin cells spread out over their body, each individually responding to changes in their environment. And by doing so, they give the octopus as a whole this sense of camouflage. And this is not unlike our immune system, which is a bunch of cells running around our body, looking for invaders and responding to them without any back and forth to our central brain. So this decentralized mode in nature is very common, and it gives you a way to adapt to changes very quickly. Now in society, we tend to do almost the opposite when we're threatened. So after 9/11, the first thing we did was create the Department of Homeland Security, which is almost the opposite organization. It's a top-down, stacked up organization where everything has to run up and down this org chart to get anything done. And we certainly saw this problem in the first major security test after 9/11, which was Hurricane Katrina. And the thing was there, everyone was asking, where's FEMA? What's going on? You know, FEMA should be here responding, and we're not getting any response. Well, where's FEMA? Look at the org chart. It's down there, buried in this stack of boxes. These boxes are not trivial little things. One whole box in this chart is the Coast Guard. So it's buried in there, non-responsive. Now, another related sort of idea from adaptable systems in nature is that nature uses redundancy to solve many types of problems. In society, we tend to think of redundancy as wasteful or as inefficient, but it's everywhere in nature. And over 3.5 billion years, I have to tell you that there's not going to be a lot of waste and inefficiency in nature. It doesn't have abundant resources to throw at a problem, and nonetheless, redundancy survives again and again. There's kind of simple redundancy in nature, which is like this centipede has multiple walking legs all doing the same thing. That's fine, that gets you somewhere. Centipedes are a fine organism, they've survived. They haven't really diversified that much, but when some lines of these arthropods became beetles, they massively diversified, so much so that about 100 years ago when the biologist J.B.S. Haldane was asked, what do all your studies of nature tell you about the creator? And he said, well, he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles. Beetles are everywhere, and they've been incredibly successful because they turn that redundancy into, again, what Garry Verma calls a creative redundancy, where individual parts are specialized into wings for solving problems, and to claws, and devices for shooting chemical weapons, and walking legs. So you get this combination in adaptable systems of multiple ways of seeing a problem with those independent eyes and independent skin cells and independent immune cells, and multiple ways of solving those problems. That gives you a lot of ways to respond to unpredictable threats. Oh, here's a shout out to you guys. A good example of how this would work in society is Google Flu Trends. So Google Flu Trends maps out when we're all searching flu-related terms, like does my kid have flu, what are flu remedies, all that. And what you see in this paper that was published in Nature on it is that it tracks extremely closely to the Center for Disease Control's flu trends data, with one major difference. The CDC, big top-down centralized organization, sends out surveys to doctors and hospitals, gets them back to Atlanta, has statisticians crunch through them, and publishes a report. On average, about 2 weeks later, then you can get virtually the same data from Google Flu Trends, which is just using those independent sensors out there, all of us searching on Google. 2 weeks when you're talking about a potential flu epidemic is a massive advantage. And it just shows a contrast between that centralized approach to seeing how the world's changing to that decentralized approach. The next major thing is that all adaptable organisms run up to their limits of adaptability. And when they run up to their limits of adaptability, they have to reach out to other organisms to extend what they can do. And this is called symbiosis. It's various types of partnerships that all organisms make with other organisms to extend their adaptability. Symbiosis is everywhere in nature, and it occurs between the most unlikely of organisms. So, for example, this little cleaner wrasse is swimming into the mouth of a large predatory grouper to clean out its teeth from parasites. Symbiosis also creates what we call emergent properties, things you wouldn't expect from this immediate interaction. So it's been shown that these large predatory fish are actually much less aggressive to all the fish on the reef patch when they're set up in these cleaning stations that the little wrasse has made. And oftentimes, throughout biological history, long-term symbiotic partnerships have emerged out of relationships that were conflictual. So you have this pattern of conflict leading to cooperation. We tend to do the opposite. We tend to put up walls between our conflicts. This is the border wall near my home in Tucson. This is down in Nogales. But I have seen human symbiotic partnerships that can blow right through these walls. And an example comes from my partner in this research, Terry Taylor, who's shown up top here. Terry Taylor has helped to facilitate partnerships, symbiotic partnerships, in this case between Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian doctors and health ministers who are all working together to identify and neutralize emerging infectious diseases no matter what side of the border wall or the disputed territories that they arise on. And these partnerships show some of the same characteristics of natural adaptable systems. Most notably, these guys are not in this to create peace in the Middle East. They are not trying to create a perfect solution. They're looking at the immediate problem and trying to solve that problem, and that's brought together the energy behind this symbiotic partnership. Also, Terry has had such success with this group that he's then replicated these partnerships in the 6 countries around the Mekong River, which are no less friendly towards one another politically, and now in countries in southern Africa. And that leads to another sort of system rule of adaptable systems, which is that the most adaptable organisms learn from success. And we're hearing a lot of buzz these days in the management literature and the organizational literature about how important it is to learn from failure. And isn't it great to learn from failure? And it sounds very self-effacing and clever. In fact, learning from failure is an evolutionary dead end. It means you die. It means you don't reproduce. Learning from success is that seed that creates a creative, recursive feedback cycle that leads to all the development of evolutionary systems. It leads to continual adaptation built off a past success. It's important enough to learn from failure. You don't want to repeat the same stupid failures again and again, but we focus way too much on learning from failure. For example, in the Townsend After Action Report, the government's report on what went wrong with Hurricane Katrina, there were over 100 different failures identified. And that's important. You want to recognize, here's what we did wrong, let's not do this again. But the most important success of the Hurricane Katrina response was completely ignored. We didn't look at what went right. That success was the Coast Guard cleaning up a 9 million gallon oil spill. Now, when would it be useful to have information about how to clean up oil in difficult circumstances in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, in the very next Gulf of Mexico disaster, which was the Deepwater Horizon. So because we had focused so much on failure and trying to learn from failure, we had lost an opportunity to learn from success in a way that may have been useful during Deepwater Horizon. So taking these ideas together, you can use them as a spotlight to analyze past situations, or you can use them as a map to sort of look forward. How can we become more adaptable going forward? And I'll take a security example as an example of the spotlight approach. So this is the unfortunate case of improvised explosive devices killing soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what I show in these charts is the monthly real deaths of US combat soldiers due to IEDs in Iraq, shown in red, and Afghanistan, shown in green. And here's a case where the Department of Defense, this big centralized organization, went into Iraq with a plan, with a lot of predictions about what it was going to look like. But it was these grunt soldiers on the ground, essentially your independent eyes looking at change and seeing what's going on, who immediately recognized that the war they were facing was nothing to do with the plans, nothing to do with the predictions, but that these unexpected IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were going to be the biggest threat to them. So much so that very early in the war, this young specialist from the Tennessee National Guard, Thomas Wilson, whose picture is shown up there, had the audacity to confront Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at a big press conference and said, you know what, we're going around, we're strapping hillbilly armor onto our vehicles, which was scrap metal. In other words, these soldiers adapting as best they could because the vehicles they had weren't going to do it. And Rumsfeld sort of tartly retorted, well, you go to war with the army you have, which is a very non-adaptable statement. Nonetheless, Congress got word of this, got very upset, said we've got to provide armor for our troops out there. So crank up the DoD procurement machine, and in what DoD considered a very fast deployment, 3 years later, these heavily armored vehicles known as MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, were sent out into country. Over those 3 years, over 1,300 US soldiers died due to IEDs in Iraq. Now, in the intervening time, soldiers weren't just sitting there getting themselves killed. They were doing all sorts of things to try to adapt. But it turned out that the most important thing they did was create symbiotic partnerships with the enemy. So there were people that were previously shooting at them, people who were previously making bombs and putting them out, and soldiers on the ground and their commanders figured out, what do these people really need? And if we can exchange that for a little bit of peace in our realm and a little bit of information, we could go a long way. And what you see pointed out here is actually underneath this curve is more and more intel from local populations going to soldiers on where the bombs are. And that peaks right around this time, and right after that, the IED deaths just plummet, well before these up-armored vehicles came into the country. Now we got these huge up-armored vehicles that we've made thousands of, and luckily enough for the DoD, things are heating up in Afghanistan again, so let's send those vehicles over there. Well, a 15 to 25 ton vehicle can go almost nowhere in Afghanistan. It had some mobility in Iraq, but there's very few roads that can handle these vehicles in Afghanistan. So if you're in the Taliban and you've got a 1-ton Toyota pickup truck, probably the most adaptable vehicle ever made, you can go anywhere at will, and you also know exactly where the US forces are going, because they are limited to certain routes. And Taliban then start using the IED approach and being, unfortunately, quite successful, learning from their successes and getting more and more successful killing with IEDs. Now, if we're thinking about taking these ideas moving forward, one stumbling block for a lot of people is this idea that we're totally different from the rest of the natural world. And I continually try to point out the fact that yes, we are different. We have a wonderful cognitive mind that's better than any other organism, and we're extremely social, and that has given us a lot of power to adapt, and that's been really good. But we're not that different in the end. We have the same genetic architecture, and we do the same fundamental things. For example, one of the things that we do that all living organisms do since the beginning of biological time is organisms have to identify what is like themselves and what's not like themselves. It's called self, non-self recognition. And it takes on all kinds of different forms, whether you're a bacteria or a salmon, for which it takes on the form of having a really good chemical sense of your home stream, so much so that you will battle your way past anything to get back to that home stream to reproduce and then die. Essentially a suicide mission to send your genes onward based on this non-self recognition system. Now in humans, it's much more complex, it's behaviorally mediated, but it's the same thing. It's the same reason why we develop such strong group identities, identities that are so strong that in extreme cases we'll kill ourselves for a cause if we believe it will benefit our group. So evolution goes beyond in humans just the simple replicating my own genes, but it's also mediated in group dynamics. All that is to say that we are this evolutionary species. We've actually been an incredibly adaptable species for most of our existence on Earth, and yet we've buffered ourselves almost through our successes from the relentless push of evolution. And the question is, how can we start becoming adaptable again? Taking these systems we have that have become somewhat unresponsive and making them much more adaptable and responsive again. And I never say anywhere in this book or anywhere I talk about like, yeah, we just got to tear down the Department of Homeland Security or tear down the Department of Defense and build them up as this adaptable organization, because I'm not into perfect solutions. Nature isn't into perfect solutions. What you want to do is identify problems within those organizations, within your own organization, within your own lives, and figure out how can I solve that problem more adaptively. And the main shift that needs to happen is to shift from a mode of giving orders to issuing challenges. So Giving orders is when a small group of experts or a single leader or single organization says, this is what you all need to do. Follow me. Issuing challenges is when you say, here's a problem we're all facing. Who among you can help us solve this problem? An early precedent for this is in the 17th century, ships were crashing all over the place because no one knew their longitude at sea. It was a huge problem. So everyone thought, oh, our great astronomers will figure out how to navigate using astronomy so that we'll figure out our longitude. But rather than relying on that, English Parliament issued a challenge, and they said, anyone who can solve this longitude problem, we'll give you a big prize. And it turned out it wasn't an astronomer, but a watchmaker who figured out if they could make a very accurate chronometer that could keep time very accurately at sea relative to the home port, you could calculate your longitude. And that's what solved the problem there. Now, the thing about challenges is they're not just, if they're done right, they're not just a one-time thing that gives you some good solutions to a problem. They can be set up to be a perpetual adaptive machine, or what I call an adaptive cascade, that goes from activating these independent sensors, which is what happens when you issue a challenge broadly and a whole bunch of people are trying to respond to this problem. And that gives you these multiple creative redundancies that you want. So you get a lot of different solutions coming from all over the place, like not just the astronomers, but the watchmakers out there. That creates opportunities for symbiosis. So you have someone responding to part of a challenge and saying, wow, I could really knock this thing off if I just work with someone like this to figure out that challenge. So it creates a natural seed for symbiotic partnerships. And if the challenge is organized correctly, and if the incentives are in place in the right way, you get this learning from success because you reiterate challenges, maybe make them more difficult the next generation, and take those successful designs and put them back into this machine so that overall you get this system that is continually generating new adaptive responses. And so I'm going to close with a few quick examples of how this is being done. So you've probably heard of DARPA's grand challenges. Here's a small arm of the Department of Defense that instead of trying to develop some new technology by going to a single contractor and waiting 30 years and going over budget by bazillions of dollars and getting something that doesn't actually solve the original problem, which is the case time and time again with military procurement programs, they just go out and say, here's a challenge, design us a completely remotely operated vehicle. And I know that that's recently been merged into the Google vehicle idea. So those are challenges that attracted a ton of attention. These started several years ago. The amazing thing, which is important to recognize about challenge-based problem solving, is the prize initially for their first grand challenge was $1 million. That's what I call couch change to the Department of Defense. Probably most of the respondents spent more than $1 million responding to those challenges. When the challenge is designed right, people want to solve the challenge, and it does not take a lot of resources to make it work. 3M discovered this. So 3M is by no means some kind of huge, adaptable, great company that's an exemplar of how to make an adaptable company. They're a pretty traditional company, but when they wanted to reduce their environmental footprint, they didn't have the CEO say, everyone recycle 20% more, do it. They had a challenge where they said, anyone who can reduce our environmental footprint anyway, give us your ideas. So you had administrative assistants over here saying, oh yeah, we could reduce a lot of paper if we did this. And you had chemists over there, each responding in their own little part of that world and saying, oh yeah, we could reduce our chemical waste a lot if we just reconfigured these fume hoods or something like that. 3M got over 8,000 different successful responses to this challenge, saved them hundreds of millions of dollars. They massively reduced their environmental footprint, and really all employees got for participation was like a certificate. Again, not a lot of motivation needed. We've seen it in the environment. Instead of having the government say, all fishermen reduce your bycatch, that's the wasteful species that are caught that are not the targeted species that fishermen have to throw back, usually to die because they've taken them up in their nets. Environmental groups and fishermen groups issued a challenge, $50,000. Anyone who can come up with better technology, gear technology, or ways of fishing that will reduce your bycatch without reducing your value catch. And this is a challenge that's gone on year after year. So you're getting better and better designs, and they're coming from the people who are experiencing the problem out where the problem is occurring, not back in Washington where the rule makers are. Finally, as a last example, in my own classes as a professor, I have for years been putting up this mocking diagram of the Department of Homeland Security and chuckling about it with audiences. Look how unadaptable that is. And then I realized, wait a second, my classes look just like the Department of Homeland Security. Because in a typical class, if the circle is me as a professor and the triangle is the class, period, I'm bringing in a little bit of information I've decided on, and I'm feeding that into the classroom. It's really noisy. I'm feeding that into the classroom, and all my students are expected basically to follow what's going on. And I wonder why most of my students are checked out. I got a few chatty Cathys who are talking all the time, and then the rest of them are just kind of texting under their table. And so what I started to do is go into class on the first day of the semester, and I rip up the syllabus. And I say, you know what? You guys all took this class on marine conservation, say. You want to know something about it, but I don't know exactly what that is. So you tell me what you want to know about marine conservation, and you also tell me what you can share with me about marine conservation, and we'll build the class from that. And the first day, we build the entire semester what we're going to talk about. I have students leading every class period with some lead topic, and for every class period, I have the rest of the students put on a riff of that, off that main topic onto a course wiki site. So there might be a main topic, and then students just before midnight on the night before class have to add something, a YouTube video, a paper, some personal experience that they had that relates to the main topic. And what happens then is you get a class that looks like this. Now the class is gathering information from all kinds of different sources, not just the one or two that I've selected for that day, but we're getting government reports, we're getting artworks, we're getting personal experiences, more literature, we're getting information from other professors, other classes they took, and it's all feeding into this class. And I'm just sitting out here on the side, not really needing to do anything because everyone in that class is fired up and ready to talk about it. And this idea of just ripping up the syllabus and letting those independent sensors work on the problem, if you will, is exactly the same as going into a meeting and ripping up the agenda and saying, you know, we're in this room together. If there's a reason we should be in this room together, let me know what it is. And if not, let's not have this meeting. So the other little tricky thing about that, the reason I have a syllabus in the first place is because my dean requires me to have a syllabus. And that's sort of the last lesson about imparting these adaptable ideas into a system that may not be so adaptable, is you want to kind of do it like a virus that has a protein coat when it comes into the body, which is protecting it from an immune response, sort of like a cloak. So you want to kind of sneak in there, get it started, and by the time you're sort of discovered, you're proliferated enough that you're sort of beyond reproach. So I've run these classes for several years now. I dutifully put in my syllabus, but I've also been evaluating them every year with an independent evaluation so that now, when my dean finally discovers that I've been ripping up the syllabus, I have a body of work and I can say, look, I've learned from my success every year. The students love this kind of class. They're way more into it. My evaluations are off the charts. That's how you want to build it up, rather than trying to break it all down to begin with. This is exactly what soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan that I talked to did. They did a lot of things that were outside of the standard operating procedure, but they kind of cloaked what they were doing until they were successful, and then they shared that success with other commanders, and it started spreading like that. So the basic idea here is that it's not just about security. It's about anywhere where the future's unpredictable, where there's risk. that using ideas from nature about how to be adaptable can be extremely helpful. And there's lots of other examples in the book and on my websites there, and I'm happy to discuss them with you now. Thank you so much. And I think there's a microphone because we're being filmed if you have questions.
Hello. I'll start with one quick question. Did you do all of the drawings and sketches for your presentation there?
Yes. I used to use Google Images to steal my drawings and images from the internet. I don't know if any of you do that. But I discovered that I do have some paid speaking gigs, and suddenly my life of being within what I consider fair use at the university and in various talks that I usually give didn't seem quite so justifiable anymore. So I just said, I'm just going to draw my own stuff, so it's copyright, so I own the copyright. And and that has been a long process because let me tell you, it's been a lot of years of downloading images from Google. So I'm building up back a legal library of images to use.
I'm Alex.
Alex, you have a question?
Not Alex.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear how, as you've been promoting the book and just, I guess, studying this, what the policymakers' reception has been. And I think some of what you hear in the press about counterinsurgency during war has been about being a lot more adaptable and listening more. And so you can already see some of this kind of stuff, but I'm just curious what the reaction you've gotten.
Yeah, so the question was sort of what's the reaction from policymakers and such, and from the very beginning of this project, which was quite a few years ago, to the present, I have been getting an unbelievably positive and enthusiastic and interested response, especially from policymakers and people who are on the ground kind of dealing with security threats because, again, they've all been hearing this charge. Some of them have sort of been ordered to be more adaptable, and yet they don't really know where to start with that. And so I've really tried, especially in this book, to put it into terms where you can do it no matter where you are in an organization or where you are in your life. You don't have to be the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to implement these things. You can be the kind of middle manager that I frequently talk to. Just by kind of changing into this challenge-based mode, you can start to inoculate these ideas. So I've gotten actually a very positive response, especially from the security world. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about adaptability and a lot about kind of dynamic systems, but it's not really clear what exactly the definition of adaptability is. I mean, we have a lot of naive understanding of it, but I can't really think of a formal definition that fits in with everything.
Yeah, you could make a formal definition for adaptability, and there's been a bunch. It's sort of changing in response to changes in the environment or something like that. But I much prefer to sort of define it by showing how it's been done in many different cases over billions of years, because part of getting value out of the concept of adaptability is to see all the diverse ways in which adaptable systems have used it. So that a ground squirrel does it completely differently than an octopus, but they both run around these same basic themes of decentralized approaches and how you use information and how you use symbiosis. So it's a simple concept, just changing in response to a changing environment, but it's that diversity underneath the concept and the fact that that diversity coalesces around a few key themes that makes it such a powerful concept for use. You think you want to ask another question? Yeah.
I guess one question is about the speed of adaptability or speed of change. We think about the Department of Defense or 3M or Google as fairly large organizations that take a long time to adapt. And species generally take a long time to adapt. And you could argue the octopus changes, in a few minutes underwater, as you mentioned. So there's different ways of defining adaptability, but it seems like it can often take centuries. And I guess I'm curious to hear, organizations oftentimes don't have like that kind of time on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the issue of the timing of adaptation, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. We often think of adaptation as this huge multi-generational thing that will only be apparent once you look back in millions of years of the fossil record. But in fact, like most biological systems, and I talk about this in the book a lot, biological systems are nested in every way. So the same kind of things you see at the genetic level occur at the cellular level, at the organismal level, at the ecosystem level. They're nested, and it's likewise nested in time. Adaptability occurs on all these different nested time scales. So it occurs virtually instantly, it occurs fairly quickly, like the octopus changing color, and yes, it occurs over multiple generations. But the more we've looked into, as biologists, adaptable systems, the more we're understanding that it's spread across this full spectrum. We're just learning right now, literally, that even our genetic structures are adapting in real time and doing some very radical changes in real time with gene jumping kind of things. So there's really no limits on the timing of adaptation. All right. Like I said, please contact me with other ideas. Some of them will pop up as you read the book, and please tell your friends about it. Thanks for coming.